Happy Friday, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of NHLN Opinion Plus, a new weekly series coming at you every Friday. This is a space for our opinions where we talk about current events and questions the Latino community are curious to know. Today, we are joined by the Commissioner of Department of Transportation, Victoria Sheehan. Commissioner Sheehan was appointed in 2015 and elected as Vice President of the American Association of State Highway and Transportation Officials in 2019. Welcome, Commissioner Sheehan, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.
We're really happy to have you, so we're going to jump in, if that's all right.
Let's get to it.
I'd like to start with the 10-year transportation plan, which launched last year under your management. So did the pandemic impact the timeline in any way? Is it still on track to be completed by 2028, or do you think it's too soon to tell?
So let me start by explaining what the 10-year plan process is. So every 2 years, the department updates our 10-year transportation plan. It's a transportation plan for all modes of transportation. And so we use the process to establish what the roadmap will be for success moving forward. The transportation plan does not include all of our transportation needs in the state of New Hampshire. Really, it's our priorities based on available funding. And so we begin the process working with municipalities and regional planning commissions to identify new plans and new projects that should be incorporated. And so that's the first phase of the plan development. Then we work with the executive councillors through a process that's known as GASSET, the Governor's Advisory Committee on Intermodal Transportation. And that's really the fun phase, because that's when we get out into the community and we host public hearings across the state to understand what our citizens and our customers would like the department to be investing our resources in. And then ultimately, the council acting as GASSET approves a version of the plan that goes to the governor. The governor gets to make some changes that are deemed a priority. And then it is transferred to the legislature, and the 10-year plan actually becomes a piece of legislation. And it's always a House bill. It starts on the House side, and then it goes to the Senate, and eventually is signed into law. And so it's a very collaborative process. We, as I said, start with public hearings across the state. But then obviously, because it is a piece of legislation, there's further opportunities for public testimony and comment in each of the legislative phases. So it really is a process which takes into consideration the wants and needs of communities. In addition to going out to do the public hearings, we also, this time around, embarked on a virtual public process as well, where we had an online survey. And so individuals who weren't able to attend the meetings in person were also able to submit comments and participate in the survey as well. And we always say that every comment is considered equally. It doesn't matter whether you come in person and testify at one of these meetings or whether you submit written comment. It's all taken into consideration as we review the plan. So the second part of your question was around the impacts of COVID-19. So the end of the process was impacted by the modified legislative session. Obviously, the legislature was limiting their meetings in person, but fortunately the 10-year plan bill was one of the pieces of legislation that made it through the process and was signed into law. We have been working very closely with our federal delegation, as well as the governor's office and the legislature, to explain what the impacts of COVID-19 have been on transportation, and specifically on our transportation revenues. So I think longer term, we should be able to deliver the projects in the 10-year plan, but we are concerned about some near-term delays because of the uncertainty around funding, both federal funding as well as state revenues.
Okay, gotcha. That's really amazing that you found a way to still have that community hearing, involve them during the pandemic with, as you said, a survey. Is that the phase you're still currently in?
No, the plan was signed into law by the governor in the month of June. And so the plan is in place. The pressure is now on the department to deliver the projects that have been prioritized in that plan. Okay. And we have a public process for each of our projects. So in addition to seeking the public input as we develop the plan itself, once we then advance each project, we go out to communities to make sure that the scope of the project is appropriate, that we're meeting the regional transportation needs, but also the needs of communities as we consider the proposed solutions. And so each individual project has its own engagement plan. And during the pandemic, we've really worked hard early on with some of the restrictions that were in place. It was not practical to have in-person meetings. And really for public health reasons, it was appropriate for us to look at virtual solutions. But we have been really pleased. We've actually seen a significant increase in participation using these virtual tools. And we're really excited about this opportunity. I think after the pandemic is behind us, we're going to continue to offer these hybrid options, especially for working people. It can be very difficult to get out to public meetings in the evening and be active participants. The virtual platforms provide additional opportunities. And so we're really excited about how we can make this our new standard going forward.
That's amazing. That's good to hear. Next, I'm really curious to hear about if COVID-19 has impacted the general use of New Hampshire transportation, seeing as according to the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering and Medicine, there was a 96% reduction among air travelers in the US during the pandemic's peak. And by midsummer, there was a 73% reduction. And then looking at public transportation, there was a 58% national reduction in travelers in July 2020 compared to transit usage in 2019. So I'm just, curious about the general impact of New Hampshire transportation, including land, air, sea-based travel.
So we are a multimodal Department of Transportation. Many times people think of us as the highway department. And certainly because we operate and maintain the state's highways, we have a lot of our employees engaged in those areas of transportation. But we also have our Division of Aeronautics, Rail and Transit, who works very closely with all of the public use airports in the state, as well as all of the transit providers. And then we also are working with all of the railroad operators, inspecting the railroad corridors to make sure that everything is safe, both for freight movement and for passengers, and especially our tourist trains. And so we are a very diverse department with a lot of different employees focused on the various modes of transportation. And when COVID-19 hit, definitely it was our aeronautics and our transit partners who were impacted the most significantly. When we were all dealing with those first few weeks, we very much supported the stay-at-home orders and the restrictions that were put in place. First and foremost, we need to keep the public safe. And so we fully understood why the restrictions were necessary, but it did impact transportation in a number of ways. So for our airports, I think when you watched the headlines and heard the great news that the state was able to procure PPE and bring it into the state to keep our first responders and others safe, many times those shipments came in on aircrafts that landed at our airports. So many people think of airports purely for commercial passenger travel, but they play a really important role when it comes to the movement of freight as well. And so while there was a reduction in passenger travel, the importance of investing in our airports and making sure that freight movement was not interrupted was extremely important. And many people don't realize this, but a lot of freight moves even on passenger aircraft. In addition to your luggage, there's many other items in those holds. So we work very closely with the airports. We were very pleased to see the CARES Act provide funding to our state airports. We as DOT did not determine how much money went to each airport. That was prescribed by the FAA, the Federal Aviation folks dispersed the money. It came through the Department of Transportation, and then we worked with the airports to make sure they could access it as quickly as possible. And then on the public transportation side, on the transit side, likewise, our transit operators, I have to really congratulate them on how quickly they were able to pivot and ensure that they were ready to respond. When it comes to public transportation, in particular, local public transit agencies, we have a lot of folks who rely on those systems. When we're talking about intercity and commuters, there's a lot more choice riders. But when we're talking about local transit, we know that there are lower income populations, seniors, folks with disabilities who need those services. And our local providers, again, got some assistance from the CARES Act, which was terrific. That meant that even in some circumstances, to eliminate or reduce the interactions between staff and customers, they were able to waive fares for periods of time. All of those federal resources also help procure PPE and ensure that they had the supplies they needed to clean those buses and provide the best possible level of service for customers while keeping safety on the forefront. So we were very fortunate the CARES Act funding helped out in those areas. And then our providers were able to get creative and innovative and find solutions to make sure they met that public need. And then the last area, of course, is our highway system. We did not feel the impacts as immediately. The timing of COVID-19 was such that, for example, our construction programs were already predetermined. Many of our contracts had been awarded. In the month of March, our contractors were ramping up. And so in that area, it was more about collaborating to make sure that we were keeping our workers safe. Certainly with the reduced traffic volumes on our highways, there was an opportunity to try and expedite work. But at the same time, there was some supply chain issues, trying to get materials from neighboring states where maybe the stay-at-home orders were even more restrictive. So longer term, it's the highway side of the house is a little bit more uncertain because the legacy of COVID-19, the increase in telework, the reduction in commuting, more folks, perhaps traveling on local roads versus commuting on our higher volume corridors. That's where we're really trying to wrap our arms around how human behavior will be different and therefore how the use of our system will be different. And maybe we need to revisit some of our projects and reprioritize some of our investments.
That's great to hear. You've all been busy, clearly. But that moves on to my second point, which you lightly touched upon, how the Pew Research Center found that Americans who are lower income, Black or Latino, and are immigrants are more likely to rely on public transportation as their main method or as regular use, because they usually statistically live farther away from their jobs and have a lack of access to automobiles. I'm curious just what general advice or resources you could offer to those who regularly rely on public transportation.
So in many cases, those that rely on public transportation in particular and our transit systems are also our essential workers. And therefore, it is critical that we find ways to provide a certain level of service to them to meet their needs. And that's going to be one of the challenges going forward, especially in larger metropolitan areas. The cost of providing the level of service that will ensure that folks have reliable and adequate scheduled service to meet their needs is going to be something that we have to navigate together. And so we're really trying to demonstrate that traveling on public transportation can be done safely. And we're tracking very closely what's happening across the country in terms of increase in COVID-19 cases, and then how transportation should respond to that. And once again, I just want to congratulate our public transit agencies. They have been very resourceful. Whether you're talking about some of our small urban providers like Nashua Transit, Manchester Transit, or Coast over on the Seacoast, they have been doing everything that they can to make sure that buses are cleaned, that drivers have physical protections. And that's really how we're going to encourage folks to use public transit moving forward, is by demonstrating that it's safe to do so. And we really need to have some choice riders as well as those that rely on the system using it every day for us to be able to provide that level of frequency for our fixed route services that will truly meet the needs of individuals who are commuting to and from work. And then when it comes to the senior population and folks with disabilities, again, the transit agencies have been very creative. Some of our rural transit providers used to take seniors to the grocery store. they pivoted and instead started picking up groceries and taking those deliveries to the seniors. And so it's been really refreshing to see communities come together and think about ways to use our existing resources in creative ways to meet the current needs and demand.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for talking with us, Commissioner Sheehan, and for being our guest on NHLN Opinion Plus.
It's been my pleasure, and thank you for this opportunity to talk about what we do at DOT.
Of course. It's been amazing just learning everything. So please, everyone, tune in next week for another episode. Follow us on Twitter at NH Latino News and Instagram at NH_Latino News. I'm Belen Dumont with NHLN Opinion Plus. See you all next time.